Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. And with that said, I would like to introduce you, my very good friend, and our next presenter, Dr. Terri Daniel. Allow me to share my screen to give a proper introduction. Now, Dr. Daniel's presentation today is called Bereavement and Bad Theology, a Toxic Cocktail. Dr. Daniel is an interfaith and interspirituality hospice chaplain, end-of-life educator, and grief counselor certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling. She's also certified in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She conducts workshops throughout the U.S. and teaches at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Dr. Daniel is also the founder of the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, as well as the Ask Dr. Death podcast, both of which you must check out. It's incredible work what she's doing. She's also the author of 4 books on death, grief, and beyond. So, Dr. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today and doing this for us. I will turn it over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And, listening to my introduction, you are probably thinking, what is a hospice chaplain doing at an atheist conference? And in order to answer that question, I'm going to start by first defining what a chaplain is. It's not a minister. It's not a pastor. It's not anything like that. Most people confuse those two things. When somebody says, when you're in the hospital and they say, would you like the chaplain to visit you? You're picturing Father Mulcahy from MASH in his clerical collar with his Bible and his big cross that he's wearing. That's not what a chaplain is. In fact, that's a Catholic priest. Chaplaincy is actually supposed to be about being religiously neutral. So it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, atheist, whatever. When you are a clinical chaplain working in a hospital or hospice, or even in a prison or police department and other places where chaplains work, you leave your personal theology at the door. And you go in and you talk to that person who is dying or who's ill or who's traumatized, and you meet them where they are theologically. Now, this is really challenging. This is the hardest thing for chaplaincy students to deal with because, everybody has their personal theology. And for me personally, I pretty much, to be honest, have a lot of disdain for most religious doctrine. So it's been quite a challenge, for me to be spiritually and religiously neutral. But that's what I do. And why is a hospice chaplain here at an atheist conference? Well, the answer is because as I gained more and more experience working with dying and grieving people, I was able to verify something I had already suspected. And it was that bad theology makes the experience of dealing with loss and trauma and grief worse. So that became sort of my passion all through graduate school, and my doctoral dissertation was on toxic theology as a contributing factor in complicated grief. So when I was doing my research, I could find tons of papers, tons of, big body of work on toxic theology. That exists. That research has been done. And I could find tons of research on complicated grief, and I'll explain to you what complicated grief is in a minute. But I didn't see anything that linked the two together. So, starting with the research that existed, and most of you guys are theologians, and in philosophy departments, you're probably not familiar with the major grief researchers, so I'm not going to drop their names, but what they've come up with, just in summary, is that there is positive religious coping and negative religious coping. That in some cases, religious coping is helpful, and in some cases, it's not. We now are beginning to get a lot of research on the cases in which it's not. And the problem with the research is that the language is so ambiguous. So, for example, in a lot of the studies that have been done on religious coping, where they've interviewed dying people or people in hospitals, the questions they would ask in the surveys are, do you believe in God? Do you go to church? Do you have a spiritual community? Where these questions are useless because they don't actually define somebody's theological outlook. If someone asked me, do I believe in God? I would say, what do you mean by God? And let's come up with a definition, and then maybe I can answer your question. Do I go to church? No. Lots of people don't go to church, but they still believe in some sort of religious structure. So the research is really flawed in general, but it's getting there. And what we're seeing, let me just see if I can find some of this research here to show you. I'll come back to that. We have been able to break it down into positive and negative religious coping. So positive religious coping could be, for example, somebody gets a terminal diagnosis and they go into perhaps mystical states, meditation, envisioning the part of their body that has cancer and sending healing energy and love, and picturing the colon nice and healthy. And that's, kind of a meditation process. Some positive religious coping can be, okay, I see that this has happened to me. God probably has something in mind that's above my comprehension, but I'll go along with it because I have faith in God. As opposed to negative religious coping, which would be God is punishing me. That's why he gave me cancer at 42 years old. Or the devil is creating this cancer. Or God is testing me because I haven't been faithful enough, because I've questioned my religion. So all that's in the negative religious coping column. And so this is what we see when we work with death and loss and grief. I'm going to give you some case examples in a little bit. I'm also going to talk about the difference between embedded and deliberative theology. Some of you may have heard of these terms before. And I'm going to talk about Fowler's stages of faith development that some of you might also be familiar with. So the thing about religion is that most religious beliefs, and I'm not necessarily saying like church doctrines, but concepts of why things happen the way they do, come from the experience of loss. So if you look at, primitive people dealing with loss, that might look like, why was there a flood? Why did our crops die? Why did a leopard come into our camp and eat the baby? And we create mythologies and we create narratives to try to rationalize this and make meaning of it. People have an innate need to make meaning of loss. And that's not the same as the earlier speaker was talking about, is, everything happens for a reason, but we do crave meaning. And when you're doing grief counseling and working with grieving people whose children have died, people whose loved ones have died in terrible ways, suicide and violence, That's what they're looking for. Like, what does this mean? Why did this happen? And of course, we can't give them an answer. So a lot of them turn to their religion for an answer. The problem is they don't find the answer there. And then when they don't find the answer, they begin to have a crisis of faith, and that complicates the grief process so that they're not healing in a productive way that sort of follows the normative trajectory of grief. I don't want to say recovering, but we don't say grief recovery, we say restoration, restoring balance. So here's how that all starts. And this is what we call embedded theology, the theology that we got as children. Most of us get our theology when we're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old from our parents, from the community around us. Maybe we go to church in the family. It's put into our heads as soon as you're able to speak, that God created the world in 7 days, and Adam and Eve, and God makes the rain, and all this stuff. When you ask a 2-year-old what God is, that's the kind of stuff that's immediately put into us. And then as it gets a little deeper and deeper, it's God punishes you when you're bad and rewards you when you're good. Then we end up with Santa Claus embodying that for us. It happens to be Christmas time right now, so I love the timing of this. And we have this story that's embedded from childhood. Most of us never think about it again. It's just in there. We go about our lives. And unless we are pursuing a career in theology and really choose to study this stuff deeply, it just sits there. We never think about it. The only time it ever comes up and comes up for questioning is when a loss happens. When something tragic happens and we go on that quest for meaning. So now you're 40 years old and your wife dies, or your child dies, or you lose everything in a flood, or whatever the loss is. It's no different than it was when we were living in caves. We're going to seek some sort of meaning. But we're not creating the mythology from scratch because it's been created for us and it's been fed into our heads. And so when you're 40 years old and you're dealing with something like this and looking for spiritual meaning, you're responding with the brain of a 5-year-old or with the theology of a 5-year-old. And that's the best tools that many people have for finding meaning and coping with loss, because they haven't thought about it or improved upon it or added to it since they were 5. And so what happens with loss and trauma is that it shakes up our assumptions. So we have certain assumptions about how life is supposed to work. For example, children should not die before their parents. Marriage should last forever. If you get in your car and you drive to the store, you have an assumption that you're going to make it to the store and come home safely. If we didn't have these assumptions, we would never leave the house. We also have assumptions that if we get a good job, it's going to provide us with enough money and we'll be secure. So we can buy a house and a boat and whatever. And then the assumption is that we're going to be safe, that it's a safe and benevolent world, that we're protected by our income, by our health, by all of this. And for some people, the belief is that they're protected by their religious faith. If I'm a good person, if I go to church, if I tithe, if I'm faithful to God, then bad things won't happen to me. And if bad things do happen to me, Jesus will be right there fixing it, taking care of it for me, and I'll be fine. And that's where we get into petitionary prayer. There's a talk here at this conference tomorrow on that I'm very much looking forward to. So the tragedy comes, the assumptions are blown away, and you're left in this kind of, lost world, the dark night of the soul, many of the theologians and the early Christian mystics called it, where you don't know what to believe anymore. And so what do? How do you fill that back up? Do you fill that back up? Or you just stay in that lost place? And remember, now you're grieving. Something terrible has happened. Your 18-year-old son killed himself 2 weeks ago. You're in this state where all your assumptions, all your beliefs, social and spiritual, are in a state of flux. And yet you're going through this horrible pain of this horrible loss. This is where Well, this isn't really where this is where deliberative theology could have been helpful. So we started out with the embedded theology that we were taught as children. Deliberative theology is what probably all of us have done, is we made a concerted effort throughout our lives, or at some point in our lives, to study theology, to study comparative religion, to study the psychology of the religion, and to really take it apart and unpack it and create a new theology or non-theology or whatever it is. We went in and we looked at it and we did the work. Remember that most people don't. Okay, hold on. I'm going to look at this question in the chat room. Just one second. Okay, let me see who asked this question. Okay, so someone's saying, I understand that it's not appropriate for a chaplain to impose their theology on someone who's grieving, but what about guiding the mourner through the proper way to understand death using critical reason, starting from the chaplain's own metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality? No. The answer to that is no. Chaplains, we do not guide them to anything. This is what's so sticky about being a chaplain. I can't say what is the proper way to understand death. I know what works for me. I know what works for a lot of people, but here is somebody whose kid just hung himself in the family garage. This is not a time to start talking philosophically about the meaning of death and the nature of reality. That's the tricky thing about being a chaplain. You're there in the moment of deep, acute crisis, and nobody can deal with that level of thinking. Sometimes as a chaplain, the best thing you can do for somebody is give them a glass of water and help them to calm down their breathing. This is where trauma training is really important in chaplaincy. So no, we don't go into deep philosophy with them. Now, if we've got a patient who is in a place where they're questioning philosophy and theology, then yes, we can help them. I have a great story about that. So I had a patient in the hospital once, a man who had just been diagnosed with something, and he was given like 3 months to live. He was probably in his late 60s, early 70s. This was in a rural community, very politically conservative, very Christian. And when I came to see this man, he asked me this question. He said, "Chaplain, where do you think Muslims and Buddhists go when they die?" That's a fun question. I love talking about that stuff, but it's not really appropriate there for him to ask me that. And the proper answer is for me to say, I have no idea. What do you think? This is how we're trained. We reflect it back on them because it's really for him to figure out on his own. I'm not going to talk to him about the 49 days of the Buddhist bardo or the Muslim afterlife and judgment in the grave and all this stuff that I know as a theologian about these different religions. That's not appropriate. The appropriate thing is to make him the star of the show. So I say to him, it's an interesting question. Why do you ask? Why do you ask this question? And he said, well, because I know that I was a sinner all my life, and I'm afraid that I'm going to go to hell, and that's where all the Muslims and Buddhists are. So that was his theology. That was his way of thinking. Now, what I want to do in a perfect world is try to talk him out of that kind of, bigoted, horrible thinking, but that's not going to happen in this 25-minute visit with him in his hospital room. So again, his theology is his business. I'm not there to educate him or to guide him. I'm there to help him find a little bit of peace in this moment and help him walk toward his death in a more peaceful way. So he's got all this anxiety about going to hell because he's a sinner. So when you have somebody like that, again, my job is to help them come to some sort of peace with this so that they can die a little more peacefully. I'm not going to change his thinking. But what you do with the theology is, and I'm now conflating this with another patient. Let me move off of this guy for a minute and give you another guy who had a similar thing. He was a biker and a meth dealer. This is another example. And he was also given a terminal diagnosis and had the same fear. I'm afraid I'm going to hell because I was a bad guy. You know, I sold drugs to teenagers. I beat up women. I was a criminal. So what you do with that, again, instead of trying to talk him out of his theology, is to get him to unpack it himself. And so what you say to that man is, well, what does your faith tell you? Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I should have prefaced that with him saying that he's a Christian now. He was this bad guy, but he became a Christian. Okay, so you're a Christian now. What does your faith tell you about being saved and going to hell? And I just dumped it on his lap and let him process it. And he goes, well, according to my faith, as long as I'm with Jesus, I'm forgiven. So all the bad things I've done in the past don't count anymore, I guess, because now I'm with Jesus and I'm forgiven. And I'm not going to say, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong. I just leave him there with that. Well, if that's what your faith says, and that is where your heart is, and you believe that, then I guess you're forgiven. You're good to go, dude. You know, ponder that until I come back and see you next week. So it's very different. So no, we don't ever talk somebody out of a negative theology. That's my point. We let them sit with their negative theology. Now, after I have that conversation with them, I might go home and write a paper about bad theology, but I'm not going to bring that into the conversation with the patient. It's not the appropriate place. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about bad theology. I want to give you some definitions of toxic theology. And as I said, there is research on this. There's a lot of it. You can Google it. A really good source is, there's a book by William Morrow called Toxic Religion and the Daughters of Job, where he uses the book of Job, you know, as sort of a foundation for questioning all these beliefs about suffering. And he defines toxic theology as, I'm reading this to you, any system in which legitimate human experience and responses are shamed by religious institutions and systems. So, you know, a normal human response and experience is, you know, having a sex drive, perhaps, you know, engaging in illegal activities, you know, or, you know, being unfaithful to your spouse, or any of the things that would be considered sins. And that's a long, long list, depending on, you know, which denomination and sect you're talking to. But normal human experiences, being gay, you know, whatever. Any of these normal human experiences are shamed by the religious institutions. So there's one description of toxic theology. And he says that the monotheistic faith in ancient Israel, the God of Israel, where most of these moral codes came from, contains shaming potential. It's all about shame. If you've studied the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as we call it now, this God that was created by this particular tribe of people is a psychopath. And just, you know, randomly tortures people when they do not worship him according to the way he would like to be worshiped. It's absolute narcissism. And the people are constantly shamed for not living up to his expectations. If you know anything about being in an abusive relationship, you'll know what that's like, is no matter what you do, you cannot make that person happy enough to treat you decently, because it's impossible, because that person, you know, has a personality disorder. That's the God of the Old Testament. It's impossible to be in his good graces. And that's what the book of Job, of course, I can't say that it teaches us anything. It just tells us a story about it. So here's some other definitions. Perfectionist, retributionist doctrines in which natural human experience does not match up with the moral requirements of demanding religious rules. Traditional religious theories of justice and judgment can create cognitive dissonance, for example, when a death seems senseless. So, as you know, some Christian beliefs systems are based on the idea that we shouldn't die. The reason we have death is because of the fall from grace, of the fall from the Garden of Eden. That was one of the punishments for human beings, is that you will now experience death. I see people in the hospital all the time who believe this. And, they're like, oh, I'm dying. This is because of original sin. And, we're all sinners and we're all going to die because of Eve. And I wouldn't laugh out loud in front of them, but when I think about that, I see somebody facing their death with all this complicated stuff coming into it, as if facing your death or facing the death of a loved one isn't hard enough. You now have all this theological stuff to sift through, and it complicates the process. And I'll get to that in a minute. Let me give you some more definitions of toxic theology. When a religious doctrine limits spiritual experience to merely accepting beliefs and doctrines, an authoritarian power hierarchy that demands obedience, policies of separatism. If you look at religious cults or high demand religious communities, you're not supposed to hang out with anybody outside that community. That's where we start looking at toxic theology. In children who grew up with religious abuse, that kind of religious abuse is they grow up in a Jehovah's Witness cult or Mormon or whatever, and they're only allowed to interact inside their own community. They're only allowed to read the spiritual or religious texts, no TV, no music, no dancing, nothing outside that small circle, which is restricted access to outside information. And there's a threat-based reality. You are always under constant threat of punishment or hell. God is also always watching. If you talk to adults who were raised in these kinds of high demand religious communities, they will tell you as children that they believed that God was this big man in the sky who was always watching them. So every single thing they did, they were on constant high alert, constant trauma stimulation, expecting to be punished. So of course they grow up with sexual issues because God's watching you masturbate. That's a huge stumbling block for people. And when you look at people who are in religious trauma therapy now, their sexuality is a mess because of this. And anything else that you're doing that God wouldn't like. And there's a whole list of things that God wouldn't like. And in fact, in Scripture, there's a long list of things that God hates. And it is actually in Scripture, God hates this, that, and the other thing. You can look it up. And of course, there's psychological mind control techniques that encourage isolation. We don't want to be with those people. Everybody in our group is blessed by God. Everybody else is going to hell. And I added a couple of my own definitions to what the scholars are saying. And I would say followers are held to a rigid, static system of belief. Questioning and exploration is discouraged. Outsiders are viewed with suspicion. Religious pluralism is unacceptable. If you're Protestant, you don't like Catholics. If you're Catholics, you don't like Protestants. If you're Christian, you don't like Jews. That kind of stuff. And you can't, mixing and matching is not acceptable. We're not allowed to cherry pick. You have to stay strictly within the doctrine. The belief that God rewards piety and faithfulness, and bad behaviors are punished by God. And here's a big one: natural disasters, epidemics, and community tragedies are curses from God. And you will find, if you look at a lot of these evangelical social media influencers, whenever there's a natural disaster, you'll hear the Pat Robertsons of the world, saying God, the earthquake in Haiti was God's punishment for gay people. So there's that belief system too, that there's this God in the sky that does this. So if you are in that.
One last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.